Jim.
Okay. Greetings and peace to you. I'm Jim Poinsett, Executive Director of the Interfaith Partnership of Greater St. Louis, and welcome to Thursdays Together. Wherever you are and whatever platform you are accessing us from, we are delighted that you have made some space in your day to share in a time of reflection. Last spring, as a response to the COVID-19 crisis, we put together a series of interfaith prayer circles. During a time of such new uncertainty, many found this a source of connection and caring, and found it to be comforting and spiritually nourishing. So nearly a year later, as we continue to struggle under the weight of grief and loneliness, economic hardship, injustice, and strife, it seems to be that the only way that we've been able to keep it together is by learning how to live this pandemic life together. So, Thursdays Together, that's what we came up with. The idea is to have local clergy and lay leaders share experiences, insight, and wisdom as we seek new paths forward through these ongoing challenges. And we hope at the Interfaith Partnership that by reflecting and processing together that we can deepen our connection with the divine, provide strength and support for one another, and help foster a more hopeful community. So recently I was on What Else, right? A conference, a Zoom conference, and the speaker was Rich Leikweg, who is the president of BJC Healthcare. And he commented during that Zoom conference that there are really 4 pandemics happening right now. There's the COVID pandemic, and then last summer laid bare a social inequity pandemic, which was always there, but we're just much more aware of it now. There is also an economic pandemic with all the hardship that is happening because of this crisis. And the 4th one is there is a mental health pandemic, one which we will be dealing with for a very long time. The COVID-19 pandemic has been, and frankly still is, traumatic, generating uncertainty and anxiety for many, if not most of us. Living in a pandemic has changed so much about how our society functions, including our day-to-day lives, how we care for the sick, how we care for the dying, and how we care for the bereaved. Our sense of control has been challenged at all levels. Coping at this time is extremely stressful as the routines and rituals that would normally bring comfort to us aren't readily accessible, which thereby exacerbates the problem by increasing feelings of isolation and loss. So today we are going to spend some time in conversation and reflection discussing the experience of trauma, grief, and loss during the pandemic. So as we talk with our guests today, and we have great conversation partners today, feel free, if you're on Zoom, to make comments in the chat. If you're watching on Facebook Live, use the comment feature there. And at the end of the time, we will hopefully be able to get to some of those comments or have you share what has resonated with what you hear today. And like I said, we have some great conversation partners today, and so I'm so pleased to introduce them. Today we have with us Dr. Sophia Graywall, who is a psychiatrist, and she is a member of the Sick Study Circle of St. Louis, and she also happens to be the president of the Interfaith Partnership Board. Also joining us today is Reverend Jake Denap. He's a spiritual caregiver at the Brookings Park Nursing Home, and he is ordained in the United Church of Christ. And our third conversation partner today is Rabbi Jessica Shafrin, and she is the manager of pastoral care at SSM Cardinal Glennon Children's Hospital. Thank you all for being here with us today and talking with us about this very important topic. And so, Dr. Graywall, I'd like to begin with you. Talk to us a little bit about just what is trauma, and how has that been presenting itself during this pandemic in your work?
Well, we saw that last year has been very unprecedented and such a challenging times for all of us. So for me, in my profession as a psychiatrist, um, we saw trauma of every kind. It was emotional trauma, there is financial trauma, there was spiritual trauma. Um, People, when I saw them, we saw such an increase in anxiety and depression cases in my profession. Um, People were isolated, and there was this loss of sense of control, like you said. We lost control of how we live our lives. We just had to learn new ways of teaching ourselves, and there were new ways of going through our I would say the rituals that we did. Now there was new rituals of masking, new rituals of hand washing, there is a new ritual of social distancing. So even the fact that social distancing, we're already so isolated in our own lives here, and then to put that on, even magnifying it in so many more ways, that we have to be distanced from each other. But again, the spirit of human spirit is so strong that we defied all that, and we kind of came through that. So even when we saw the increase in the mental health, also quarantining in one ways was good, that it brought the loved ones together, so we had time to reflect upon our relationships with each other. But then also the trauma was that when we were spending too much time together, we saw increase in domestic violence, we saw increase in substance abuse, we saw increase in more emotional and physical abuse, because people were kind of pushed together. But that is, as a professional, I saw it in my practice, and then we had to deal with that. So even though there is financial crisis, and there is loss of jobs, loss of businesses, with that came a very strong mental health crisis. And I think we are going to see that this is not going to end here. We just probably have to deal with it for a long period of time. We saw parents who had to become teachers for their children, and for that they had to take on double roles. And then the definition of who is going to do what in the household kind of changed, and that brought more responsibility. Then the kids were socially isolated, and that is going to affect their spiritual growth, their intellectual growth, their social growth, and that has been affected. And how it is going to impact in future, we do not know as yet. But those are all something that we really have to look at once we are going through this pandemic.
Well, I'm really struck by the different facets of loss there, right? So not only did we lose, sort of our, freedom to just be out and about and live our lives as we were used to, but it comes at a greater sort. There are all kinds of things to loss, and we haven't even gotten into people that have experienced loved ones being sick or dying yet. But that loss really, we usually think in terms of grief and loss as when somebody dies or we lose a specific job or whatever. But this is really goes deeper than just maybe one or two events. It's multifaceted in people's lives.
Absolutely. I mean, we have lost control of pretty much sense of whatever we were. That sense of identity has kind of been modified for some people much more. And obviously it is affecting people who are, in the lower socioeconomic strata. We see more of an impact. And whereas in the social inequity that we saw has really been more widened, and it has come more to the forefront to see that there is so much social inequity in our society. And even through this pandemic, we found how the help received, or how people reacted in the pandemic, was also seen differently in every socioeconomic strata. And that also brought about to the forefront that, the the racial divide, the financial divide, the economic divide, and everything, it just became more and more magnified because of the
Hmm.
pandemic. Even though all these things were there before, but they somehow just, blew up in our faces, I would say.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh. And so what has it, and I'm sure it even impacted your own practice, right? So how has it, what's it been like guiding people through this trauma on top of whatever else you might have been treating with them before, or an increase in a number of patients? What's it like been guiding people through this trauma, loss, and grief during this time?
It's not been easy. Obviously, you can do only so much over Zoom and phone calls. Obviously, just to become available as a profession, we have given them, all right, if we are available more for you, and go ahead and make more follow-up appointments. I'm going into medical jargon because I'm just getting
Yeah.
out of the office. But that is what it is. So to give them tools on how to be more mindful, be aware of what is here and now, and make the best of it. If I go back to my faith,
Yeah.
my faith teaches me, my Sikh tradition teaches me that we have to be in chardi kala, or even in high spirits during the time of adversity. So we have to be having the hope all the time. We cannot be anywhere without hope, and faith brings us hope. So, that is where I sought for myself to go
Yeah.
back into my faith and say I have to be in chardi kala and be acceptance of his hukum, or his will. And when with acceptance we are able to tolerate most of the adversity, and that makes us go forward and deal with it the way we can the best.
Hmm. So what other wisdom, or do you want to expound on that anymore from your uh, faith tradition, would you like to share with us as we go through this pandemic, continue going through this pandemic together?
Yes. In Sikh tradition, as I said, we are told to be more merciful, kind, and compassionate, especially in the face of tradition. And our the if I can recite something from my scripture,
Please.
that Tera pana meetha lage, har naam padarat nanak mange. It means that everything happens per his will, and his will is always supreme. So we should accept happiness with the misery, and with the same state of mind as being given by the merciful God. And even when we're living in his hukum, his will, it is easier for us to accept whatever is being given to us. Simar, simar, kate sab rog. So by ever remembering him, all diseases are healed. So the tradition in Sikh faith is to recite his name over and over and over again. We call it Simran. So by doing Simran, you heal yourself and you heal everybody around you. So Antar Bahar Sang Rakhwala, and he is your protector anywhere and everywhere you go. So by holding true to your faith, you're able to go through any adversity that comes your way. So even during this, even when we found that we could not go to the Gurdwara and be together as a sangat, as a gathering, technology helped. We all had Zoom sangat. There was recitation of sermons over Zoom. We were able to even reach out to people who would not normally come to the Gurdwara. So people helped out how to be there. And when you talked about loss of life, there were quite a
Yeah.
few funerals that happened in the community, but then they were again small funerals, but they were all again, people were able to reach out by phone calls, by messaging, and then, cooking food and taking it to their house, leaving it even by their doorstep. And people who got quarantined, you just, as community came together and we helped each other. Um, we were holding food drives, we were holding uh, drives to connect the daily things that people need, and taking it out to the shelters, because in the shelters the workers who normally come to cook the food were not coming. So they reached out to the community that we need things for people who are residing in the shelters. So as community, we came together and we held food drives where people would cook a lot of food and take it and then provide it to the shelter. So the one way to deal with also the adversity was to go ahead and be available to each other and support each other.
Having having hope for all the time and helping each other during this adversity. Great words. Is there anything further you'd like to share with us at this point, or we can?
Sophia, you've muted yourself.
Sorry. I was going to recite Chaupai by Guru Gobind Singh Ji, who's 10th Guru of Sikhs. And in the Chaupai, Guru Gobind Singh Ji says, जो कल को एक बार त्याए हैं ताके काल निकट नहीं आए हैं रक्षा होए ताहे सब काला दुष्ट अरिष्ट तरे तत् सब काला. Those who meditate upon you, adversity does not approach them. They are protected at all times. Their obstacles are removed. Kirpa drist tanjahe nihariye take tap tanak mein hariye. O God, whoever you behold with grace are instantly freed of suffering and their agonies removed. Riddh siddh karme sab hoi, dust chach hai sake na koi. All temporal and spiritual powers come to bless them in their own home, and no enemy can touch their shadow. In Sikh faith, we all go back to our scripture and try to get the word of the Guru to guide us through the day, through our lives. So for us, it was always going back to what the Guru is going to tell us to do that day or through the life. And that gives solace to most of us. And that is how we live our life, by his name, by his will, and accepting whatever he gives us through this. So with full acceptance comes spiritual bliss. So we pray for his mercy to give us the strength and guide us through these times. Nanak Naam Chardi Kala, Tere Pani Sarbatta Pala. O Nanak, bless the whole humanity.
Dr. Graywall, thank you for sharing those pieces of scripture for us. A real source of support. Thank you for your time. We'll talk with you in a little bit some more. Our next conversation is with Jake Denap. Jake, we saw each other shortly before the pandemic began, and this is our only time together back on Zoom. It's been far too long, and I hope that you have been staying well, and you and your family are staying safe. But tell me about your life in the last year, right? What is the nature of trauma and grief and loss that you have been observing during your work in your ministry here?
Yeah, thanks, Jimmy. It's good to see you and Sophia and Jessica. I'm excited to see some friends and familiar faces. The last year has been, I mean, personally and professionally, it's been quite a year, as we all know, in our own experiences. And I think, you know, it's been my experience as a chaplain, as a spiritual caregiver to a community of people who have been identified as those who are the most vulnerable to the processes of this disease, being the elderly and those who are infirm already. It's taken what we always knew, which is that grief is a primary color of life. It is one that is mixed into the hue of all that it means to be human. And if that's true in everyday life, how much more so has that been made known and true in the midst of these 4+ fold pandemics, as you noted? One of the things that I've observed anecdotally, at least in my experiences being here with folks, is that not only has it changed the way that we do our lives, the way that we live our lives, but it also changed the way that people are telling the story of their lives. It seems to me that, and perhaps I should default to Dr. Graywall on this, but it seems to me that so many of us have these internalized stories of trauma and of suffering and of grief and of loss that lay within us. And then I've observed for many people that with the onset of the pandemic, so too were those stories that were once laying dormant were made raw and revealed again in new ways. So I heard people telling stories about what it means to live in the time of COVID, but I've heard members of my community talking about what it meant to live through the Depression era economy, what it meant to live as a soldier and civilian during the Second World War, what it meant to live through their divorce, no matter how many years ago it was, what it meant for them to transition from life as a couple to life as a widow in this world. These traumas, these griefs that shape all that we see and understand about the world have found themselves commingled and made raw in new ways. And so the stories we tell have changed.
And in your particular setting, then, how difficult was it for you to walk along with such a vulnerable population during this time, and to make sure that people had a way to share these stories?
Well, it's been hard. It's been hard for healthcare workers across the board, as we all have known and have celebrated at various points throughout this. Not only because of their exhaustion and the trauma of caring for so many people as they transition from this life into death, from the trauma of working in an environment where you quite literally at times are putting your life at risk to care for other people. But it's been especially hard for residents in communities like my own, for those who find themselves in nursing homes or in long-term care communities or retirement communities. Because these often are folks who already find themselves behind walls. They find themselves behind the walls of institutionalized medicine and caregiving. They find themselves behind the walls of diseases like dementia. And they find themselves behind the walls that our culture creates by not making space for those who can't keep up with the pace with which we have advanced technologically and socially to feel included and a part of this world. And so when the world transitioned to Zoom, we weren't able to do that because our folks couldn't use computers, especially not with their own. That is, if they had the resources to provide one for themselves. Right. Our folks didn't have the ability, if they had a computer, always the technological understanding to access it. Many of them don't have the physical abilities to be present in the way that sitting at a desk or holding a piece of technology requires you to be. And many of them don't have the cognitive ability to recognize and to distinguish what is happening virtually and what is happening in their own reality. And so as we made these transitions, folks got left behind. When church services or religious gatherings went to digital platforms, the church lady who would get a ride from a neighbor, fellow congregant on Sunday mornings, no longer had a place to go and no longer had a way to connect.
Yeah, that's so just another layer of loss, right? I mean, loss of the ritual, loss of the community where you could share these stories, where you're known, and all that. The world got very, very small very quickly, and that had to have been a loss. How were you able? How were you able to guide people? Take me through how you guide people through that.
Yeah, we had to create space in addition to the protective measures that were being asked of folks to help them to get into contact with whatever source of meaning making they could in the midst of this. So for some, that meant things like window visits from family members who simply could peer through the glass at their beloveds and not exchange words, but exchange the presence as much as they could. It meant figuring out ways to connect people as best we could through platforms by having caregivers, operate the technology as much as possible. It meant making space for one-on-one time with people to connect them with their communities. But also, I would say it meant praying, and it meant doing those invisible things that we trust have an impact, that we trust the energy of love is never diminished or destroyed, but always expansive and always bringing more and more people into the fold. And so doing anything we could to remind people, no matter what, at the end of the day, that they are loved.
Is there some wisdom from your tradition, faith tradition, that was either sustaining to you or in your work, or or sustaining to you personally, that you would like to share with us as we continue to go through this pandemic?
Yeah, well, so in the Christian tradition, next week, we will celebrate what is known as Holy Week. For us in this tradition, it is the most sacred time of the liturgical calendar, which culminates in the holiest day of our year, Easter. Holy Week is a week-long enactment of the Christian narrative of redemption or of transformation. And what I mean by that is that this is the time in which we practice what it means to follow Jesus through suffering and death and resurrection.
Going back to
This, for Christians, is the essential narrative because we believe that this is the essential pattern for all of life. It means that this pattern of transformation is always one that invites us into death transformed instead of death avoided. And this is something that we believe is true at the atomic level and something that we believe is true at the cosmic level. And so for those of us who are Christian, Jesus is the blending together of those two things. And so for Christian spirituality, our understanding of our spiritual life is rooted in this notion of death and resurrection, or of suffering and renewal, if you prefer that language. There's a reason too that we celebrate this pattern of life at the time of year that we do, is the natural world observes the pattern as well, emerging from the death of winter into the new life of spring, or as Rabbi Shafrin might note, alongside our Jewish friends who recognize this pattern in the story of Passover, from bondage to liberation. For the Christian, this pattern is the thing that permeates all that is. And so the life of the Christian is a life that calls us to practice this pattern, and not just during Holy Week, but routinely throughout all of our lives, beginning with our first enactment of it at the moment of baptism. And what we see, I think, that happens when we practice not resisting death or suffering, but transforming it, is that with each experience to do so, we go a little bit deeper, like an electrical wire being grounded, so that we face less resistance the next time, to trust more. And the next time there's more energy, and the next time, and the next time. As has been noted, this pandemic has left most of us, many of us, feeling like we are perpetually suspended in the suffering. But the Christian tradition teaches us that if we leave our eyes open long enough in the dark, there will be light that shines. And it's important to note too, again, that while every one of us has experience with the absurd, with the tragic, with the nonsensical, with the unjust, we do not, however, all experience these pains in the same way. And so it's an important part of our teaching and our tradition that we do our best not to judge others too harshly for their reactions, having no clue what it is that brought them to this point. But having said that, what we do believe is that if we could see all of our wounds, no matter how it is that they came to be, all the way through to their transformative effect, as Jesus does during Holy Week, then those wounds might become sacred wounds, and thus be something that we need not deny, that we need not disguise, that we need not export onto others. And so I think this is one of the geniuses of Jesus's teaching and of Jesus's life in this regard, because what it reveals is that God uses, not that God causes, but that God uses tragedy and suffering and pain and even death itself, not to wound or to punish us, but to bring us into a larger identity. And what's more, I would add, is that for a Christian, Jesus in Holy Week, Jesus on the cross demonstrates the declaration of God saying, I cannot stop your suffering, but you can know that I am in it with you. And in such a divine economy, if you will, everything then can be transmuted. Everything can be used. Everything is never wasted. And so it's my hope, and what the hope that I think the Christian wisdom tradition teaches us, is that if that is true, then it must be true even of these current pandemics.
Amen. Thank you. Our next conversation partner is Rabbi Jessica Shafrin. She is the manager of pastoral care at SSM Cardinal Glennon Children's Hospital. Rabbi Shafrin, welcome. And tell us a little bit about your context and the nature of trauma and grief and loss that you have been observing during the pandemic.
So thanks for inviting me here. I'm so honored to be part of this conversation. The beginning of this pandemic, about just over a year ago, I remember being on a Zoom call, and it was very different than the one we're on right now. And it was one in which I was being zoomed into a hospice room as a rabbi. And there was a TV in the hospice room, and in front of me, I was looking at a bed, and I was saying the vidui, the ritual prayer to say towards the end of life, with one of my clients, who I was then working for JFS, Jewish Family and Services. I remember reading the words, singing the words, chanting, and right out of frame was my son. Because during the pandemic, we're bringing it all together. We're seeing in new eyes, and we're inviting into these deep moments and witnessing these spiritual moments with one another in a new way. So I've called grief over the past year, I've termed it causational grief. Because what I have witnessed is that within the Jewish tradition, we are being forced to pause our formal grief. In the beginning of the pandemic, we were performing funerals, graveside, minimal amount of people, where the response that families were saying was, in a year from now, when we can get back together, we'll have the real funeral. We'll do an unveiling, we'll do a stone dedication, and that's when we'll really gather together and mourn this loss. And the effects that that's having on our soul, I think we will be dealing with for a very long time, unfortunately. And so that's why I think we were just we are being forced to press pause on this. I used to say that, Judaism does mourning in a way that makes sense to me. I mean, I'm Jewish, so it makes sense to me. It gives an outline for how we mourn during the first week, how we mourn during the first 30 days, and how we mourn during the first year after a relative's death. Part of that is letting people in, is sharing the stories, letting people into the homes during Shiva, allowing the stories of the loved ones to be told, sharing the pictures, and bringing food.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
And we're not doing that. We can't do that. So we're forced to mourn in a different way.
Well, yeah. So right, and that speaks again to that's yet another ritual, right, that has been lost to the pandemic, and we have to grieve not being able to grieve, which is the corollary to your causational grief. How do you guide people through that?
Just being there. The more people who are there, the more people who reach out, that's just showing, tell me the story. Zoom Shiva can be a little weird.
Yeah.
but we've done it in a few different ways. And one way that I've seen it and that I participated is time slots. A few people at a time coming by on Zoom and asking about the loved one. Tell me a story. Giving that space. Because we can help the others walk through the mourning by walking through with them.
Did you have more to say on that?
I was going to say,
yeah,
in my other role at, being in the hospital,
Mhm.
it's very
Yeah.
different. And sitting with somebody a parent who's grieving a loss of a child, and we're wearing masks and we're trying to be 6 feet apart, and sitting there and being present in a way that maybe somebody else can't, right? I say the most important gift that chaplains can give to families is the gift of being present.
Right.
In saying, tell me about your child, tell me about the things that they love to do.
And from the outside coming in, right, there's also a ritual of going to visit at the hospital, which is a ritual of sorts, right? And so if there's a family member that's in the hospital, then part of my ritual is making time in my day to go, and then you sit and you watch the television and watch them eat the bad food, and all that. There's a ritual to that, and that was cut off too. So I mean, you tell me, but it seems to me that your job even sort of doubled or tripled, is that because there was no sharing for the longest time of that steady stream of people to come and sit when you couldn't be there, or alongside you while you were there.
And I think that's what we hear a lot from parents. Parents are bedside, but I heard just yesterday, a parent said to me, if this was any other time, we'd had so many people in this room.
Right.
And holding them, being able to hold them and support them, and reminding them that those people are still there. They wish that they're there. Their souls are there. Their prayers are there. I've seen, and just reminding them that they will be there to support them when they leave the hospital, just even though they're not there in that room at that moment.
Using your words, back to you, like Jewish people do the set mourning very well, and the grieving, and so but yet we're still in this pausational grief. What's the wisdom from your tradition that has personally given you hope, and that could give us hope as we hope that we're not on pausational grief? Well, we're just going to be dealing with it for a time. So what wisdom from your tradition have you been using to sustain yourself, and can share with us as we continue through this?
So, as Reverend Denap said earlier, we're in a few days, we are going to be sitting, Jews all over the world are going to be sitting at a Seder. If it's on Zoom, it's in person, it's virtual, if it's small, whatever it is, we are going to be sitting at Seder on our Passover night. We are going to recite the words, B'chol dor vador, in every generation. So that's telling us that we are a people of our relationship to our past and our relationship to our future. And we are here in the present. We're here remembering the history that shaped us as individuals and as a community, and how that's going to influence the direction and destination of where we're going to go to come, and we're going to go forward. So I'm reminded of two things. One is the story of Honi, the circle drawer, the circle maker, who came across a man who was an older man who was planting a tree. And he said to him, why are you planting this tree? How you're not going to be old enough to benefit from the fruits of this tree. And he said, just like there were trees with fruits on it when I came into this world, so too in the next generation, there's going to be fruits from this tree that I plant that will benefit them. So we remember, that our link from here to the future, and what has a verse of Torah from Exodus that has always given me strength during dark times, during personal dark times, during communal dark times. is a verse that says, Ozi v'zimrat yah vayehili lishua. My strength with the song of God will be my salvation. And I can be found singing this, my soul song, in the car, very loud or soft or whatever my soul needs at that time. And this gives me strength. And I think that it can bring the community strength as well, knowing that we have come from bondage, we have come into freedom, and we are learning day by day how to walk in this freedom with God's help. And so I sing for you. Ozi vezimrat yah vayahili lishua. May my strength and the strength of the divine be my salvation.